Desertion has always been one of the gravest military crimes. But what happens when a soldier simply doesn't show up? Going AWOL, absent without leave, may sound straightforward, but the line between a minor infraction and a career-ending mistake is far from clear. In some cases, it can lead to life-altering consequences or worse. In this video, we'll dive into the hidden world of military discipline, where going AWOL can quickly spiral into something far more serious. What happens when a soldier disappears, and how does the military decide whether to punish or forgive? Stick around to find out how seemingly small decisions can lead to massive consequences, and what happens when soldiers push the limits of military law. And while it may seem like a rare occurrence, going AWOL is surprisingly common in the US Armed Forces, often leading to consequences no one expects. Between 2001 and 2012, when the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were at their heights, about 50,000 American service members went AWOL. Not all of these instances were the same though. Being AWOL only means that a service member is not at the place at the time he or she is ordered to be there. As you might have guessed, this is a broad definition and can count innocuous instances, such as a service member oversleeping after a hard day's work, or even being a victim of circumstances that messed up some travel plans. Most service members who go AWOL fall under these circumstances. Most of the ones who don't are usually gone for a few days and then wind up returning to their posts. What punishments might these people expect? Under Article 86 of the Uniform Code for Military Justice, service members who go AWOL are sometimes disciplined through a non-judicial punishment, meaning that a court-martial is not required. This sort of discipline is imposed by an AWOL service member's commanding officer. Being AWOL does not automatically lead to punishment. If a service member is just late for duty one time, their commanding officer might overlook it. Make it into a habit though, and that's when a service member can start to expect seeing disciplinary action for going AWOL. The type and intent of offense involved in going AWOL matters a lot. Under Title 10 of the United States Code, a service member's commanding officer can impose confinement to a certain specified limits on officers under his or her command for a period of up to 30 days. Generals can impose this penalty along with cuts in pay. Non-commissioned officers can face harsher penalties without a court-martial. These penalties include restriction to specified limits for 30 days, detention for 14 days, forfeiture of a week's pay, demotion to the lowest rank, private in the US Army and Marine Corps, seaman recruit in the Navy and Coast Guard, airman basic in the Air Force, and specialist 1 in the Space Force, and up to 2 weeks of extra duties, potentially fatiguing ones. Think menial labor like cleaning the mess hall at odd hours of the day. Innocuous or non-severe cases of service members going AWOL for a short period of time who committed no other misconduct will often be punished in this way. Even service members who go AWOL once can be punished like this, which is why it's best for them to not make a habit of it. Do it once and you might get away with it. Do it 2 or 3 times in short order and you can start to expect eating some or all of these penalties. Punishments tend to escalate depending on how innocuous a service member's feat of being AWOL really was. If service members go AWOL for a while during downtime, the punishment will likely not be as severe as those who do so while being given important tasks. For example, those who are assigned to guard duty and then leave their posts without authorization, but also without intention to abandon it, can be subject to a 3-month confinement, demotion to the lowest rank, and a 66% pay cut for 3 months. Punishments escalate the longer a service member is AWOL. Just the act of being missing for a period of up to 3 days can result in a month's confinement, demotion to the lowest rank, and the 66% pay cut. Going AWOL for a period between 3 and 30 days can result in 6 months of confinement, a 66% pay cut for 6 months, and demotion to the lowest rank. Service members who go AWOL, especially for longer periods of time or who commit other bad acts during the times they are unaccounted for, will often be given a discharge under less than honorable circumstances. If a service member's AWOL status remains contained within a period of 30 days, this will probably be a bad conduct discharge. Service members who receive a bad conduct discharge forfeit most military benefits like preferential loans, healthcare from the VA, and access to higher education, especially if the bad conduct discharge came at the judgment of a court-martial. Intention also matters in terms of discharge-related punishments. For example, if service members miss a deployment because of neglect or carelessness, rather than premeditated avoidance, this is the type of discharge that will usually be handed out to them if they are indeed discharged. Service members who are assigned to guard duty and leave their posts with the intention of abandoning them will also likely get a bad conduct discharge, in addition to forfeiture of all pay and a potential 6-month period of imprisonment. But even if you don't intend to abandon important duty, you can still be punished severely, just by wanting to take an extra day off. If you're a service member who only goes AWOL to avoid a field drill rather than to abandon your unit, you can still face the forfeiture of all benefits, demotion to the lowest rank, and 6 months of confinement, along with a bad conduct discharge. Things are different if service members go AWOL with the premeditated purpose of avoiding a deployment or other important duties. These soldiers can face imprisonment for 2 years and demotion to the lowest rank. They can also face a dishonorable discharge. This is the worst type of way to leave the US military and can only be imposed through a court-martial. Service members who are dishonorably discharged forgo all benefits from having joined the military. They can expect no healthcare from the VA, preferential loans, or any assistance in higher education, but it gets worse than that. Most states regard dishonorable discharge as the equivalent of a felony conviction in civilian life, because this punishment is usually only given out in case of extreme offenses, such as those involving murder or sexual assault. As a result, those who are punished with dishonorable discharges will be unable to pass the federal background check required to own a firearm, and may be deprived of other rights and benefits such as government assistance, running for office, or even voting in certain jurisdictions. The private sector will likely avoid any relationship with these former service members too. Although many states and cities list veteran status as a protected class, meaning that businesses and government agencies cannot discriminate against them for having worn a uniform, this status usually does not apply to service members who have been dishonorably discharged. Dishonorably discharged service members can therefore expect to find difficulties in getting a job, accessing higher education, or finding housing once they're back in civilian life. In some cases, dishonorable discharges can come with execution, and now we start to get into the territory of desertion. If a service member goes AWOL for less than 30 days, the punishments for such behavior may vary significantly. However, once 30 days have passed, an AWOL service member is at high risk of being considered a deserter. This is not automatically the case though. The absent service member must be judged as having no intention of returning. However, once desertion status is confirmed, standard punishments at this phase include up to a year's imprisonment, stripping of all pay and benefits, and demotion to the lowest rank. If deserted service members are caught by law enforcement, they can face confinement for up to 18 months. A dishonorable discharge is also likely. Punishments for desertion tend to vary depending on the nature of the desertion, how deserters have been caught, and the intentions behind the desertion. Service members who have been gone for a while but who turn themselves in can face 2 years of confinement, forfeiture of all pay and benefits, demotion to the lowest rank, and a dishonorable discharge. Deserted service members who are apprehended by law enforcement can face up to 3 years of imprisonment in the brig in addition to other punishments. The thought process here is that deserted service members who are caught by police were probably doing something else bad too. Desertion with the intention of avoiding dangerous duties comes with additional penalties because it's considered an act of cowardice. Deserters of this type who have been caught can be imprisoned for up to 5 years, although no absence-related punishment has exceeded 2 years of confinement since September 11, 2001. There is also a difference between deserting a peacetime unit and deserting during wartime. Wartime desertion is considered the ultimate act of cowardice and a betrayal of one's comrades. As a result, the maximum punishment for desertion under these circumstances remains death, but no such penalty has been imposed on a service member since World War II. The last one who received such a punishment was Eddie Slovik, who was executed on January 31, 1945, and this was an extreme case. Slovik was one of 21,049 American service members who a court-martial had tried and convicted for desertion. Of these, 49 were sentenced to death, but he was the only one actually executed. Slovik himself was the only service member to be executed for desertion since the Civil War. Perhaps there were early warning signs. Before his military career, Slovik had a habit of stealing items from the drugstore that employed him, acts which brought him to reform school. By the time of his military service, Slovik also had a criminal record that included destruction of property, embezzlement, and public intoxication. Despite his run-ins with the law in civilian life, he was drafted in 1944 and pleaded with his superiors to put him in a non-combatant role, pleas which fell on deaf ears. He was sent to the front lines in France after D-Day, but deserted in August, when his company in the 28th Division came under enemy artillery bombardment. At first, his AWOL status came because he and a comrade, Private John Tankey, were separated from their unit during the confusion, and were inadvertently left behind when it moved out. The pair met up with a Canadian unit and spent 6 weeks with it, comfortable that they were no longer facing the shelling their comrades did on the front line. On October 5th, the Canadians arranged for them to return to duty with their old unit. Tankey did, but Slovik pleaded with his commanding officer to put him in the rear. When this was denied, Slovik asked if it would be considered an act of desertion if he left, to which the answer was yes. Nevertheless, Slovik decided to leave. Over the pleas of Tankey, he would abandon his post and later turn himself into a cook in a different unit, with a note explaining his reasons for desertion. Even now, his commanders tried to reason with him. urging him to tear up the note he had written before it could be entered into evidence. His crime would be forgiven if he returned to duty, but he refused, expecting to be imprisoned and then dishonorably discharged. This was a punishment that he could live with, given his already existing criminal record. Alas, he severely miscalculated, since he repeatedly refused to return to duty despite being given every opportunity to do so. He was hauled in front of a court-martial, where his previous criminal record did not endear him to his judge-advocate reviewer. The court-martial found Slovik guilty and sentenced him to death by firing squad. The judge-advocate remarked, "He has directly challenged the authority of the government, and future discipline depends upon a resolute reply to this challenge. If the death penalty is ever to be imposed for desertion, it should be imposed in this case, not as a punitive measure nor as retribution, but to maintain that discipline upon which alone an army can succeed against the enemy." The sentence came at a time that army officers might have felt appropriate for a warning. Slovik was sentenced in November. Shortly afterward, the Battle of the Bulge began. In this last-gasp German offensive, desertion was too common of a problem to be ignored. Slovik wrote to General Eisenhower pleading for clemency on December 9th, but the Battle of the Bulge started a week later, and the Supreme Allied Commander refused it under such circumstances. Slovik was executed on January 31st, 1945, and buried in France in a nondescript cemetery with 94 other American soldiers who had been discharged dishonorably. These men had been executed for crimes including rape and murder. It was an indication of how low of a status convicted deserters can potentially have in the military. After his death, Slovik's widow tried to have his remains repatriated and to collect the benefits of his insurance, but both were denied because of his dishonorable discharge. She persisted though, arguing that it was unfair to single him out for desertion when over 20,000 others had been convicted of the same offense. Nevertheless, desertion was still a crime punishable by death. His remains were finally returned to the United States in 1987, almost a decade after his widow's death. Others tried to clear Slovik's name after her, but none succeeded. A good example of how desertion is handled in modern times can be found in the case of Bowe Bergdahl, which is the highest profile case of it. On June 30th, 2009, Bergdahl abandoned his post in Paktika province in eastern Afghanistan. 3 days earlier, he sent an email to his father lambasting the United States and its armed forces. After claiming that he was ashamed to be an American, Bergdahl lamented the army that he served under. "It's the biggest joke the world has to laugh at. It's the army of liars, backstabbers, fools and bullies. The few good sergeants are getting out as soon as they can." By the end of June, Bergdahl had been captured by the Taliban. After years of torture and use in propaganda videos, he was released in 2014 as part of a prisoner exchange. He was returned to duty and assigned to menial positions such as being a clerk. There he needed to be kept under guard, as army brass feared he might come under attack from his comrades, such as the stigma around desertion. Bergdahl's return to duty did not mean that his desertion was forgiven either. The army began investigating the circumstances of his disappearance and capture. In October 2017, Bergdahl pleaded guilty to desertion and misbehavior before the enemy. He was sentenced the following month. Punishments included demotion to private, forfeiture of $10,000 in payment, and a dishonorable discharge. He avoided the imprisonment. The Court of Appeals of the Armed Forces later upheld this conviction, but in July 2023, the United States District Court for the District of Columbia voided the conviction on technical grounds, as the officer who presided over Bergdahl's court-martial failed to disclose his then ongoing application to become a federal immigration judge. The Justice Department later appealed this decision, and as of May 2024, the case is sitting before the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. That the United States government would be willing to go so far to punish a service member for desertion 15 years after the event might suggest that it will go to the ends of the earth to find and hold deserters accountable, much like the Romans did in ancient times. But this was not always the case. International humanitarian law may provide room for deserters to legally justify their actions. According to Resolution 1998-77 of the United Nations Human Rights Commission, conscientious objection to military service, even as people perform it, is a consistent exercise of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, as specified in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as Article 18 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. Resolution 1998-77 emphasizes that states should take the necessary measures to refrain from subjecting conscientious objectors to imprisonment and to repeated punishment for failure to perform military service. One service member put this concept to the test. Jeremy Hinsman fled from military service in 2004 because of his supposed conscientious objection to the ongoing war in Iraq. He sought refugee status in Canada in February, a month after his unit, the 82nd Airborne, deployed to the front. However, a Canadian court rejected his application for refugee status the following year, finding that his behavior was not consistent with that of being a conscientious objector, and that the US military already has regulations in place that allow for exemption from service or assignment to non-combat roles for those who invoke genuine reasons for conscience. Although the court denied his request for refugee status, the case dragged on for years. If he ever comes back to the United States, Hinzman would face a general court-martial, a dishonorable discharge from the US Army, and imprisonment for up to 5 years. All of the punishments around desertion and AWOL status sound severe. They need to be to create a level of deterrence against bad behavior, but a law is only as good as its enforcement. Surprisingly, the US military is lax in handing out punishments for absence-related offenses. Only about 5% of those who become absent for extended periods of time actually face punishment for their AWOL status. When it comes to outright deserters, law enforcement usually finds them only if they make an effort to stand out. The military prioritizes punishing high-profile deserters like Bergdahl and Hinzman, rather than hunting down mundane ones. In peacetime, the brass is usually content to look the other way and let problematic service members go, rather than keeping them around and potentially eroding discipline. If circumstances get more dire, though, such as was the case during the Second World War, the US military would be entirely at liberty to crack down more severely, just as it did in the case of Eddie Slovik. As always, the punishment for going AWOL or deserting is proportionate to the nature of the circumstances behind the disappearance, and death remains an officially sanctioned punishment for desertion. Do you think anyone will be executed in the US military for desertion again? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out why you should never shoot medics in a war, or click this other video instead.